Welcome back to the EU Knowledge Hub on Prevention of Radicalisation podcast. I'm Drew Mikhael, and in this series we're diving into the realities behind violent extremism, the myths that make prevention harder, and the practical lessons that help us build safer, more resilient societies. Last time in episode 1 we talked about young people. We explored why minors are so vulnerable to extremist narratives and why what looks like rebellion or defiance is often, in truth, unmet emotional needs. Today's question is about us and how we communicate, how we policymakers, practitioners, and even researchers must reflect on how we talk to people about violence and how that leads to helping us avoid violence in the future. Today is about strategic communications. We ask, how do we communicate in a world where narratives spread faster than facts, where emotions carry more weight than logic, and where trust in institutions is at historic lows?
Whilst I cannot give any confirmation at this stage around fatalities and casualties, what I can say is that it is clear that this is one of New Zealand's darkest days. Clearly, what has happened here is an extraordinary and unprecedented act of violence. Many of those who will have been directly affected by this shooting may be migrants to New Zealand. They may even be refugees here. They have chosen to make New Zealand their home, and it is their home. They are us. The person who has perpetuated this violence against us is not. They have no place in New Zealand. There is no place in New Zealand for such acts of extreme and unprecedented violence, which it is clear this act was. For now, my thoughts, and I'm sure the thoughts of all New Zealanders, are with those who have been affected and also with their families. My thoughts also to those in Christchurch who are still dealing with an unfolding situation.
That was then New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern speaking in the immediate aftermath of the horrific Christchurch attacks. She displayed what our experts today would describe as an excellent example of crisis communication. So then we ask, how do our government, policymakers, and society as a whole try to win the battle of hearts and minds through strategic communications? For decades, we've used this phrase, hearts and minds. But if we're honest, the strategy has rarely lived up to that promise. Too often, we've misunderstood real grievances, ignored emotional needs, and treated the communication as public relations rather than a human conversation. And all the while, in those decades, the information environment has shifted beneath our feet. We now live on a media diet shaped by algorithms that reward rage, fear, and simplicity. An attention economy where a meme can travel further than a policy briefing, and where references to extremist symbols and policies appear in everyday discourse, but not as warnings of division, but as punchlines, provocations, and most worryingly, political currency. So how do governments, practitioners, and policymakers operate in this world? How do they give pushback on these narratives, especially when their communication with the public is greeted with skepticism? Distrust is high and misinformation moves at the speed of light, while governments are traditionally slow and lack the agility to keep up. Knowing that every message they put out is likely to become a weapon in someone else's narrative. So how do we overcome these challenges? Where do we begin?
The grievances are real, the emotions are real, and people in this day and age need to be acknowledged. And I think this is the mistake we have made, is that we haven't acknowledged enough the grievances and the emotions because they are there. And this is why, I go back to Christchurch. What I really appreciated is it was the acknowledgement of what people were going through, so they feel that they're being heard, that their pain is the country's pain, if that makes sense. those moments are really, really important. They're very, very crucial because they're almost like a test also for our governments, because this is when we can build reputational trust. So if we show compassion, understanding, bringing people together, perhaps we can increase public trust.
That was Dr. Virginie André. She's a researcher who studies how extremist narratives spread, and more importantly, how they resonate emotionally before they resonate ideologically. Her work focuses on the role emotions play in shaping how people interpret information: fear, anxiety, grief, anger, and how these collective emotions influence public responses during moments of crisis. She is someone who pays close attention to how leaders communicate in those moments, and how communication can either build trust or deepen division. We heard her describe Prime Minister Ardern's response as an example of what good, human-centered communication that sets the table for long-term policy looks like.
An important point to make is that her call of action was really about bringing people together. One aspect that I didn't mention is that she also made it very, very clear that she was not going to identify the perpetrator or talk about the perpetrator, because the point was not to give exactly what he wanted, which was giving visibility and oxygen. So I think, if our policymakers, particularly in times of crisis, can learn anything from Christchurch, it would be those two key moments where we do not give visibility and oxygen to terrorists and extremists. And of course is how can we do better emotional governance by integrating collective emotions and bringing people together, because it was about unity.
These moments are opportunities to bring people together, but crucially, good strategic communication is not only about talking. It has to be about listening and understanding.
I think it comes down to where strategic communications is important, but it doesn't work on its own. So it also means that, for instance, you were talking about how do we take the pulse, monitoring what's out there, what's happening, how are we monitoring people's emotions, emerging trends, emerging narratives, so that we're not, I like to use this metaphor where we're kind of always constantly running after the train. It'd be nice to actually be sitting on the train, yeah? So I guess here my point is that Stratcoms also needs the component of monitoring, then also having the tools that allows to actually read the room, have the pulse, understand what are the collective emotions out there. Is it more anger? Is it more fear? Is it more... It's also important to understand that once you have a sense of what type of emotions are, in the collective, to know that every emotion triggers a certain type of response or behavior. So that's also equally important to understand, is the association between the emotions and the behaviors.
The train metaphor evokes a constant sense of governments and institutions always trying to catch up to narratives, spending their energy on reacting to situations, rather than strategically placing themselves in the middle. But considering today's context, with so many avenues of communication and so many emerging extremist material, is it even possible for government experts to effectively read the room?
It's becoming increasingly difficult also to identify very clearly ideological extremism, because it's becoming so diffuse and so confused at the same time, right? So it's not as clear-cut as it used to be, which means we still have the tools, but because the information environment has changed, the way ideology functions has become also much more diffuse. Narratives have become a lot more fragmented, competing with each other. So it becomes increasingly difficult, I think, also not just for governments, but also for even Stratcoms experts to have a good grasp of what are those complexities. We're also struggling with, something that I had raised about 3 years ago, so was the mainstreaming of extremism. So how do we deal with the mainstreaming of extremism when becoming more extreme in our thoughts, in our expressions, causing new sorts of issues and challenges in tackling that in particular? I wouldn't say it as a failure. I think it's more about new challenges and whether we are able to develop the more granular understanding, because we're not into a situation where we can look at this with a binary lens. It's not black and white anymore. Some of my colleagues always laugh because I think I'm a bit of a hippie, but I do think that it's the best metaphor for this. I think it's about a rainbow. You need to think about a rainbow. A rainbow is beautiful because it has so many different shades of color, right? So our understanding has to become that rainbow in the sense that we need to grasp those nuances.
When talking to Dr. André, I noticed I started to become more concerned about the challenges we face today. Modern communication, how bad faith actors can use it to rapidly spread their ideas. But thankfully, she was quick to put me back on track.
I don't think the new information environment has made it harder. If anything, it has allowed the amplification. The speed may be different than 20 years ago, but 20 years ago we didn't have the technology we have today. So again, it's about those nuances and adaptation and more agility.
Being agile. Virginie was always careful to mention that this is the key approach to making sure governments can move from reactive to strategic positioning, getting ahead of the news. But she also told us it was important to understand the nuances of the messaging itself, the audience that violent extremists are trying to attract and why, so we can stop looking at it in black and white and start to properly understand it.
I think black and white thinking is always a singular narrative, and it distorts reality.
That was Jordy Nyenhuis. Jordy works on tackling polarization and the way narratives spread in today's information environment, particularly how complex realities are flattened into simple opposing sides. He does this as the co-founder of an organization called Dare to be Grey, a singularly perfect name to describe the challenge of facing violent extremism in general, but particularly in today's media landscape. He is well placed to tell us how to create credible alternatives to black and white thinking.
Our organization was founded on that premise that black and white thinking is drowning out nuance in pretty much all conversations currently. And it also speaks to the core of that process of radicalization, right? Most radical groups want a polarized society because, one, it's easier to communicate what you want to achieve. It's easier to recruit people, but it's also easier to define enemies and your own in-group. So it's at the crux of most radicalization processes. And we also see that like foreign interference, disinformation, hate speech, it's all connected to that black and white worldview. So it speaks to wider societal issues we're seeing right now. Our organization was originally founded back in 2016, so almost 10 years ago, as the antidote to that. That's also why the name of the organization is a call to action, right? It's a call on people to recognize the gray middle ground and also speak up for it. And there are kind of risks connected to that as well, because it speaks to the dare part in our name, because you're not always the nice guy if you stand up for nuance or complexity or speak out on behalf of that.
Jordy, through his experience, spoke to the key issues of trying to tackle polarization. The fact is, it is easy to create emotional hooks, and modern technology only amplifies it.
Polarizing narratives are all about a hero and an enemy, a villain. And if you promote that worldview that you stand up and you become the hero in that story, and once you join that group, you can become the hero as well, and you can fight for something, and you'll fight for a better future, that's very appealing. It resonates with our tribal mind. And as humans, we're pretty tribal. We like to define ourselves by linking ourselves to groups, in groups, but by doing that, you automatically also create this out group. So it's very easy to create emotional, resonant content around those stories, because it's baked into our humanity. And now social media is giving us platforms where you can spread that to millions and millions at the same time. And those stories work because they're emotional. Donald Trump, during the presidential debates, when he was debating Kamala Harris, made this comment about they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs, for example. For me, that's always an example about how emotional stories drown out nuanced and complex arguments, because that's going to stick. And anything that's well argumented is dry, it's factual, it's kind of boring. That just doesn't resonate.
Jordy and I discussed how the wider threat of speech, often as he said designed to create polarization based on emotions, is threatening not only the trust in governments, but also making the work to counter that extremism very dangerous.
The shrinking civil space is quite concerning, right? Loads of NGOs and partner organizations of ours as well are now under attack, almost physically in some of the countries we're working in, which is extremely concerning. People right now are looking for hope, and that gives me hope, because that means that people are still, looking for that dot on the horizon, something to hatch onto. Some of the political developments we've been seeing, including the Dutch elections, for me were kind of hopeful. Of course, it's nuanced. It's not like everything has been solved, but there's some indicators of hope over there. When I look at how democracy has become a theme also for the European Commission, with new initiatives like the Democracy Shield, that brings me some hope.
I was pleased to hear Jordy's optimism, but if we're to catch up with the dynamic challenges of the media landscape, we crucially have to treat strategic communications not as an add-on, but a fundamental part of our programming.
Who could have predicted that we were facing a COVID pandemic where the entire world came to a standstill? Who could have envisioned that Putin would invade Ukraine a year after? Like, the world is unpredictable, and all those big issues will have an impact on your work, especially when you're communicating, because it's on the top of people's minds. So be kind to yourself. Be flexible with your approaches as well. Maybe you've created the best looking video, but if you think it's never going to resonate or times have changed, don't publish it, even though it's on your proposal and on your paper. So I think there's some ways you can build in agility in your work, but the simplest thing is just to be out there and be tapped in.
Our first two guests gave me cautious optimism that despite the growing polarization that new technologies seem tailor-made to spread, we can also use that information environment and those technologies to do a better job of tackling these problems.
There's nothing worse really than government communications trying to be cool. I mean, all due respect, but, nobody wants to see an EU commissioner trying to do like a TikTok style video. It's very cringe and it just doesn't connect.
That was Stéphanie O'Keeffe, who works at the intersection of strategic communications, government and public trust. Her work focuses on how institutions communicate in moments of crisis and polarization, and crucially, how they avoid amplifying the very dynamics they're trying to counter. Stéphanie's perspective helps us think more clearly about the responsibility governments carry, not just to be heard, but to communicate in ways that are credible. So, if copying the attention economy isn't the answer, if governments shouldn't try to be influencers in a space built for outrage and speed, then the question becomes, what should they do instead?
I think if we want to offer people credible alternatives to these kind of more extreme pathways, I think we need credible messengers. And to have credible messengers, I think we need to really engage with actual people who are from the affected communities we're trying to reach. So, for example, in Ireland, North and South, we have this growing far-right movement, which is quite a new phenomenon for us. And much of it's driven by the influence of online platforms, far-right personalities in the UK and US spreading these very divisive messages and scapegoating non-Irish-born communities and people of colour. There are some great examples of community-driven organisations that are challenging these harmful messages. And one example I can think of is a non-profit in Ireland called Hope Not Hate, and they work within communities to challenge extremism and build resilience of local communities who are susceptible to this far-right messaging. And they're kind of doing this great work, creating alternative narratives that are based on togetherness and unity. And they're really trying to emphasize the things that we have in common rather than the things that make us different. So they kind of leverage the power of hope and empower people to kind of build more resilient, inclusive societies.
We started off this episode talking to Virginie, who emphasized that it was about understanding, and Stéphanie reiterates it here, adding a crucial element for governments who have to be able to speak to the emotion and needs of the audience. Giving an example of the historic 2018 referendum in the Republic of Ireland to repeal the 8th Constitutional Amendment, overturning the ban on abortion, Stéphanie explained the success of the campaign.
I think the campaign was so effective because it was really kind of grounded in personal storytelling, and that was a deliberate kind of strategy, I think, to shift away from abstract concepts and kind of questions of morality and ethics and really kind of grounding it in lived experience. And I think that's something that can be applied in the PCV space. So yeah, in this campaign you had various different kind of aspects of it, but one of the aspects was this In Her Shoes campaign where you had people sharing very personal stories of women and different people sharing stories of travelling to the UK to access abortion care and explaining why they had made that very personal decision and what that experience was like for them. So you had these kind of testimonies that were shared in, social media threads, public talks, newspaper interviews. And for me, it was very striking because it really kind of humanized an issue and the impact was huge. And that kind of personal factor, I think, was really kind of cited by undecided voters who said that those personal stories were the reason why they had changed their minds.
Stéphanie, throughout our conversation, was always keen to point out that credibility is crucial. And if you aren't credible, it'll get found out quickly. Thankfully, there's a way to address this problem.
I think audiences, especially now, we have very kind of savvy audiences and they're very kind of sensitive to being deceived or lied to. So authenticity and honesty, I think, are really key. You're not going to be able to win people over by having cooler memes, or trying to use the kind of the same tactics that extremists use, because again, that kind of the idea of coolness factor of a government is zero, and that's okay. I think that governments need to find their own space and they need to play to their strengths and they need to be authentic as well. So I think we need to be looking at how to reach people before they've been radicalised and kind of focusing efforts on people when they're in that kind of grey zone, looking at the middle and the kind of the middle and edges of the polarised extremes, because within those kind of areas you have people who might be politically aware, who might kind of empathise with some of the grievances that are, exploited by extremists, but who are still kind of undecided as to how to kind of, what to do with these grievances. So I think if you're looking at people who are kind of consuming extremist content, then you're not going to change their views with a kind of a government social media account telling people, why, extremism is wrong. And, we know that kind of debunking individual claims is kind of a lost cause at this stage. So I think we're kind of talking more and more about, things like pre-bunking. We're looking at the kind of the prevention stage, looking at how we can help people kind of resist misinformation, how to kind of teach them or empower them rather to kind of recognise manipulative tactics before they encounter them.
Governments can't get into a competition with extremist groups. They have to find their own lane. And Stéphanie outlined the audience they should be appealing to and how they should be doing it.
If we look at which areas our governments are prioritising when it comes to allocation of resources, is it education? Is it the health sector? Is it housing? Is it community resilience? Or is it scaling up defence spending, securing our borders and spending money on the management of immigration? I think those policy decisions send really strong messages to the public. So, are the government communicating on the things that bring us closer or the things that bring us further apart? So I think there has to be substance and tangible efforts behind strategic communications for them to be real and to work. So, again, otherwise it's just spin and people see through that. So my hope, if I can put my own positive spin on it, is that governments can kind of look beyond the short term and think strategically and creatively when it comes to the policies that shape people's everyday lives, and that strategic communications should be in support of those policies. So we shouldn't be doing stratcoms for the sake of it. It has to be in support of something bigger.
Or else it's just spin. Stephanie perfectly illustrates how strategic communications can quickly be rendered impotent if there isn't a serious attempt to match policy with the words we use to communicate with the public. In 2017 and 2018, I led a research project in Nigeria, Lebanon, and Tunisia that examined how extremist messaging works. And I still remember the sinking feeling I had at just how effective it all was. And in the 8 or so years since, the media landscape has only become more polarised, with far more powerful tools for spreading those messages at speed and scale. So it's safe to say I carry real concerns about our capacity to tackle this problem. But after speaking with our guests this week, I came away convinced that creative and effective strategic communications, the kind that genuinely moves the needle in the battle for hearts and minds, is possible. It won't be easy, and it will take work. It will require governments to listen and to actively support groups like Dare to be Grey. It will require engaging with people like Virginie and Stéphanie, who have outlined concrete ways to turn policy into action in an environment where polarisation clearly sells. But importantly, and perhaps most importantly, better stories exist than the hero and villain binaries that Virginie and Jordy warned us about. Narratives built on fear, scapegoating, and division. As Jacinda Ardern's response to the Christchurch attacks showed, polarisation isn't the only thing that resonates. Leadership that acknowledges pain, resists amplification, and brings people together can resonate just as loudly. Thank you for listening to the EU Knowledge Hub on Prevention of Radicalisation podcast, episode 2, Winning Hearts and Minds, Strategic Communication. You can hear the full conversations with our guests in the show notes and explore more about the Hub's work, the people I speak with, and the policies shaping prevention efforts across Europe. Next time, join me to take a closer look at the everyday steps we can take to prevent radicalisation by exploring the role of education, family, civil society, NGOs, and community-based strategies. I'm Drew Mikhael. I'll see you next time.